If you're tired of your opponents targeting you first because you used to play Grand Arbiter Augustin, well, first I hope you learned your lesson. But if you want to further convince them that you're not a threat, just play Phelddagrif, the big purple hippo that gives things to your opponents. But wait, don't actually give them things. That would be group hug, and nobody likes that. Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and this channel is all about those unconventional commander decks. So it's time to talk about the big purple hippo. It's Phelddagrif, a 4/4 legendary Phelddagrif. It costs 1 green, white, blue, so this is a Bant deck, and Phelddagrif has 3 dumb abilities. You can pay green to give it trample until end of turn, and target opponent creates a 1/1 green hippo token. You can pay white to give it flying until end of turn, and target opponent gains 2 life. And you can pay blue and return Phelddagrif to its owner's hand, and target opponent may draw a card. Now with these activated abilities that clearly give things to your opponent, creature tokens, life, and cards, Phelddagrif is most commonly leading a group hug deck, which usually aims to give nice things to all of your opponents, and usually has no chance of winning the game itself. Now, don't hit that back button just yet, because this is not a group hug deck. I like to build unconventional decks, but I prefer that they have at least some chance of winning a game. So before I talk about what we're doing with Phelddagrif, I'd like to invite you to join me for a little rant. Because before we talk about what Phelddagrif can be, we need to talk about what it shouldn't be. Because the floor, I think, for Phelddagrif is to look at the hippo and say, hey, this thing gives things to my opponents, let's do more of that. Like Dictative Crufix, which gives each player more card draw, or Rites of Flourishing, which gives each player more mana. These types of symmetrical effects make sure that everyone gets to play the game. That player who got mana screwed has a better chance to catch up, but that player who's in the lead also gets to win that much harder. These uncontrollable symmetrical effects just amplify everyone's game plan. The games go faster, but you won't be helping the underdogs or slowing down the leader. You just accelerate everyone roughly evenly. Now this is obviously not ideal, so some more enlightened Phelddagrif decks will use targeted hug cards. A Flump, for example, lets you and target opponent draw a card when it's dealt damage, so if one opponent attacks you and you block with Flump, you can have another opponent draw a card. A Benevolent Offering gives you and an opponent of your choice a few creature tokens, and then it lets you and an opponent of your choice gain life equal to twice the number of creatures you each control. Because now we're giving things out on a targeted basis, you have the possibility of making deals with your opponents. You can say, attack me with your 1/1 and I'll block with Flump and we'll each draw a card. But I'll only do it if you kill that other player's Bolas' Citadel first. Even without deals, you can use these spells and effects to help bolster other players that are behind, to help you take down an opponent who's gained the upper hand. And this is okay. But let me say this, I had a Phelddagrif deck for a while, a few years ago, and it was okay. But I learned a few things from this deck. First, having nice cards in your deck won't stop people from hitting you. Sometimes that opponent just has an Itali in play, and it wants to attack, and hey, you're open, so you're going to get hit. Threatening to block with Flump and letting another opponent draw a card will not discourage that Itali from swinging at you. And threatening to make player B gain 10 life with Phelddagrif if player A destroys your Mirari's Wake, player A won't care, your Mirari's Wake will still get destroyed. I've tried this before, it doesn't work. I've seen other gameplay videos that try this, it doesn't work. If the only buttons and levers your deck can push are these I'll give stuff to one of my opponent's things, it just doesn't protect you very well. Now you could play your own powerhouse cards to protect yourself. I've tried really hard not to do this. The last thing you want as a political or group hug deck is for other people to think you're a threat. You want your opponents to aim their removal spells at each other and leave you alone. But you still want to be protected from any stray bullets that might come your way just because it's convenient. And this is really hard to do. But it gets even harder, because like I said, we do actually want to win the game. And there are some situations in which it's beneficial for you to give other players card draw or mana ramp or more life. In reality, this is just most likely not the case. Giving your opponents more resources rarely helps you win the game. Usually, if you give your opponents more cards, those cards will be used against you eventually. And this is a big problem because that's all Phelddagrif does. It gives your opponents more life or more creatures or some card draw. And then finally, I found that when playing Phelddagrif, if you focus too much on giving things to your opponents, you might not have enough resources for yourself. And no matter how nice you are to your opponents, you won't win games if you can't ramp or draw cards yourself. So this is quite a challenge, but I think we're ready to summarize the objectives of this deck. First, we want to be able to win games. Again, this isn't a group hug deck. Secondly, we want to be able to use political effects to our advantage, without just giving our opponents things for free. After all, even though I'm kind of hating on group hug here, we do want some political influence. Otherwise, why are we playing Phelddagrif? And thirdly, we want to have some resilience to getting knocked out by our opponents. And this can come from politics, from our value engines, from appearing non-threatening, or from powerful threats that consume our opponent's resources to deal with, or more likely some combination of these things. So let's talk about how we've built Phelddagrif. We'll talk about each of these three objectives, starting with the last step, winning the game. So in building this deck, I started with the last step. How do we win the game? I decided to include several combos because this minimizes the number of cards that we'll need to dedicate to win conditions. Now note that all of these combos generally revolve around Phelddagrif, and none of them are infinite combos. And the first one is just big purple hippo commander damage using Blackblade Reforged. The Phelddagrif can give itself trample and flying, so equipping it with Blackblade Reforged and really pushing up its power and toughness will let you get in a lot of damage and threaten a commander damage win. It's even better that Phelddagrif's third ability lets you bounce it back to your hand to protect it. Now this will slow you down, but at least it makes it very hard for your opponents to permanently deal with your commander. And next we have a few combos that take advantage of Phelddagrif's ability to give your opponents 1/1 creature tokens for just 1 green mana each. A Suture Priest has whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you may have that player lose 1 life. Combined with Phelddagrif, you can now pay green to have target opponent lose 1 life, and you're only limited by the amount of green mana that you have to spend. Though again, this deck has a pretty good amount of ramp, but it does not create infinite mana, so this isn't an infinite combo in this deck. We can also use Angel's Trumpet. This is a 3 mana artifact that gives all creatures vigilance, and at the beginning of each player's end step, tap all untapped creatures that player controls that didn't attack this turn, and Angel's Trumpet deals damage to the player equal to the number of creatures tapped this way. So this forces our opponents to attack with all of those hippos that we've given them, or they'll take 1 damage for each one that didn't attack at the end of their turn. So they'll either bash at each other with hippos, well, more likely we're only giving hippos to one player so that the other players won't have blockers. And anyways, if they use those hippos to beat on each other, that's great for us. Or if they choose not to attack and they take damage, that's fine too. But we really need to add a second card to this combo. We'll need something like Ghostly Prison or Propaganda to discourage those hippos from attacking us. And I need to credit Cyber for bringing this combo to my attention, so thank you, Cyber. But we have more ways to use those hippo tokens. They're great fodder for Azuri's Predation. This 8 mana sorcery has you create a 4/4 green beast token for each creature your opponents control. Each of those beasts fights a different one of those creatures. So if you can give your opponents enough hippos, Azuri's Predation will create a game-winning number of 4/4 beasts for you. Well, provided they survive until your next turn, since they won't have haste so they can't attack right away. But if you played Dingastaff first, then you might not need to wait that long to finish out the game. A Dingastaff is an artifact with, whenever a creature dies, Dingastaff deals 2 damage to that creature's controller. So now, when Azuri's Predation resolves and your beast tokens fight all of those hippos, your opponents will take 2 damage for each hippo that died under their control, on top of any other creatures that your beast tokens happen to kill. But my favorite, or at least most unique, combo piece for Phelddagrif is Krovak's Ascendant Hero. This is a big 6 mana 4/4, which is not great. It has other white creatures you control get +1/+1, which we don't care about, but more importantly, non-white creatures get -1/-1. Krovaks will instantly kill all of your opponent's hippos as long as they aren't getting a toughness boost from something. So when you combine it with Dingastaff, you'll get to do a bunch of damage. And what's better, unlike with Azuri's Predation, unless your opponents remove one of your combo pieces, you can continue to drain them, essentially doing 2 damage to an opponent for each green mana you spend through Phelddagrif to give that opponent a Hippo token. And this brings me to my last combo, and another reason that I really like Krovax in this deck, because Krovax has one last ability we haven't read yet. You can pay 2 life to return Krovax Ascendant Hero to its owner's hand. So our last combo combines Krovax and Phelddagrif with Soul Conduit. This 6 mana artifact lets you pay 6 and tap it to have 2 target players exchange life totals. So first we use Phelddagrif's second ability to have target opponent gain 2 life, as much as we can afford to give them for 1 might mana each time. Then we can pay 2 life to return Krovax to our hand. But while this ability is on the stack, we'll activate it again, and again, and again, until we're down to 1 or 2 life. And then finally, we'll activate Soul Conduit to swap life totals with whomever we've boosted with Phelddagrif, and reduce that player down to 1 or 2 life, while our life total gets really big. So notably, this combo won't actually kill anyone, but it can bring them very close to death. And this combo doesn't actually require Phelddagrif either. If an opponent has a high life total, we can benefit by swapping life with them, even without boosting their life total with Phelddagrif. So those are the combos that this deck will use to win the game. And those are pretty much the only ways this deck will win, because we don't want to generate a lot of threat. So this is very much a political and defensive deck that's intended to survive until it can assemble its very specific win conditions. And one of the ways that we'll survive is through selective politics. Let's talk about some of our political cards next. Now, if you're playing Phelddagrif in the command zone, you're probably playing some sort of group hug or politics deck. And so I've picked some political cards for inclusion in this deck, but again, I wanted to be very careful to pick political cards that actually help me win and don't help my opponents win. Let's start with some of my favorite ones, the Advocates. We're running a few of these creatures that tap to do a thing, but they also return 1 or more target cards in an opponent's graveyard to their hand. Spurn Mage Advocate, for example, has tap, return 2 target cards in an opponent's graveyard to their hand, destroy target attacking creature. A Null Mage Advocate taps to return 2 target cards in an opponent's graveyard to their hand, and you destroy target artifact or enchantment. I'm also using Pulse Mage Advocate, which taps to return 3 cards in an opponent's graveyard to their hand, and you get to return target creature card from your graveyard to play. And finally, Shield Mage Advocate taps to return a single target card in an opponent's graveyard to their hand, and you prevent all damage that will be dealt to target creature or player this turn by a source of your choice. Now, I really like these Advocate creatures as political cards because you get to pick the opponent's cards that they get back from their graveyard to their hand. If there's a scary Kozilek, for example, hanging around, you can pick someone's Swords to Plowshares, because you can reasonably predict how that card will be used. When you get to pick what your opponents get back from their graveyard, you can minimize the chance that they'll use it against you. You can also, of course, make some political deals if that's your thing. Now, a couple of other mechanical details about these Advocate creatures. First, the activation cost is just tapping the creature. Returning the cards to your opponent's hand happens when the ability resolves. So if the ability gets countered or something, you're not just giving your opponent's cards for free. And notice that most of these Advocates, with the exception of Shield Mage Advocate, have multiple targets. First, you're targeting cards in your opponent's graveyard, and you're also targeting something else. For example, Pulse Mage Advocate is targeting a creature card in your graveyard. So the ability won't be countered if some of those targets are illegal before the ability resolves, as long as at least one target is still legal. This means, for example, that you can exile your opponent's graveyard with Pulse Mage Advocate's trigger on the stack, and the ability will still resolve, but your opponent won't get their stuff back. This is kind of a fringe application, but you could pair these guys with Graveyard Hate like Crook of Condemnation. I didn't go that far with this deck, but you could. Now, the primary disadvantage of these Advocate creatures is that they need to tap to do their thing, so you can't use them the turn you cast them. I've included Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves in the deck just for that purpose, to give them haste. The Hexproof and Shroud is nice too, though. So again, I really like these Advocate creatures because they give our opponents things in the best way possible, and that is completely at our discretion. We can also selectively gift our opponents with Dawnbreak Reclaimer. This is a 6 mana 5/5 angel, and it has at the beginning of your end step, choose a creature card in an opponent's graveyard, then that player chooses a creature card in your graveyard, you may return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. Again, I like this one because it selectively returns a creature of your choice from an opponent's graveyard, an opponent of your choice, to the battlefield once each turn during your end step. So you get to pick the opponent and the card they get back. And of course they get to do the same for you. So this is decent graveyard recursion that provides excellent political leverage. Now we also need to play the new Wedding Ring. This $20 card already sees play in 65% of Phelddagrif decks on EDHREC, and for good reason. When it enters the battlefield, if it was cast, then you get to have target opponent make a copy of it. And it has, whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring draws a card during their turn, you draw a card. And whenever an opponent who controls an artifact named Wedding Ring gains life during their turn, you gain that much life. So basically you and another player of your choice will each have a Wedding Ring. Whenever they draw a card during their turn, you also draw a card. Whenever they gain life during their turn, you also gain that much life. And also conversely, whenever you draw a card during your turn, they also draw a card. Whenever you gain life during your turn, they also gain that much life. So this is great with Phelddagrif because you can use Phelddagrif's abilities during your opponent's turn to give that player life or card draw, which you will also receive. So during that opponent's turn, Phelddagrif will basically let you pay white, and then you and that opponent each gain 2 life. Or you pay blue, and you and that opponent each draw a card. Now making your opponents draw cards and gain life isn't great, but you'll generally get much more out of this than they will, because you don't need to be drawing cards too much or gaining life too much during your turn, so your opponent most likely won't be getting much value from this. And again, you get to pick the opponent that gets the copy of Wedding Ring. Now we'll also use some combat manipulation effects. These cards won't benefit your opponents too much, but they are political. Vow of Flight and Vow of Wildness, for example, are enchant creature auras, and the enchanted creature gets some buff, but it can't attack you or a planeswalker you control. So these are great for manipulating our opponents against each other. Of course, we also have a couple of somewhat similar auras in Martial Impetus and Psychic Impetus. These auras goad the enchanted creature, so it has to attack each combat if able, and it has to attack a player other than you if able. So these are great because unlike the Vow auras, they force the creature to attack. But they also don't protect you if you're the only player left, because a goaded creature can attack you if there aren't any other players to attack. And as long as we're messing around with combat, I really like Sly Instigator. This 4-mana creature lets you pay blue and tap it to goad target creature, and even better, until your next turn that creature can't be blocked. Again, this is really great for getting your opponents to deal with each other and take their eyes off of you. So those are some of the methods that we'll use in this deck to engage in politics and manipulate the board state to our advantage. But we can't rely purely on politics to survive. Let's talk about our other value engines and defensive strategies. So one problem I've had when playing Phelddagrif decks in the past is that while they can generate value for other players, they can have a hard time generating value for themselves. So you might run out of cards, or mana, or life. So I really wanted a potent value package for this deck to ensure that you get to stay in the game, without generating too much threat. I tried a few options, and I got the best results with an enchantments theme. So we'll use lots of enchantments in this deck, like those Vow and Impetusaurus we just mentioned, along with Enchantress effects like Sithis Harvest's Hand or Setessan Champion to keep our hand filled. Ghostly Prison, Propaganda, Sphere of Safety, Elephant Grass, these are more enchantments that help fuel our enchantment synergies, and they're also great protection, making our opponents pay 2 or more mana for each creature they want to attack us with, which is great if we're using Phelddagrif to flood our opponents with 1/1 tokens, because these enchantments will make it very impractical for opponents to attack us with those tokens. I also like Spirit Loop. This is a self-recurring aura that says whenever the enchanted creature deals damage, you gain that much life. Spirit Loop is in this deck mainly to point our opponent's creatures away from us, because we can enchant our opponent's creatures with this, and when we do, we'll gain life whenever that creature deals damage. So it won't really hurt us in combat, unless it's a commander because we'll still take commander damage, or if it has Infect, or of course if the attack just kills us in one swing before the triggered life gain ability can resolve. But it doesn't just help protect us from combat. Spirit Loop is also great to put on your opponent's Perforos, for example. Now we'll also use Authority of the Consuls. This is another enchantment. It slows your opponents down by making their creatures enter the battlefield tapped. It also gains you 1 life whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control. So it combos decently with Phelddagrif, which can give your opponents creature tokens for just 1 green mana each, as well as just giving you incidental life gain whenever your opponents deploy their own creatures. In fact, I like this combination with Phelddagrif so much that I've included redundancies for this effect with Essence Warden, Soul Warden, and Soul's Attendant, each of which also gain us 1 life whenever any other creature enters the battlefield, including on our opponent's side of the battlefield. Now, Essence Warden, Soul Warden, and Soul's Attendant are creatures, not enchantments, but they're still a great fit for this deck. We'll also use enchantments for a lot of our other card draw, mana ramp, and removal. Mystic Remora, Sylvan Library, and Ristic Study, for example, are all enchantment-based card draw that'll fill our hand, basically for doing nothing at all other than breathing. For removal, we've got Imprisoned in the Moon and Song of the Dryads, which are great auras that turn their target into a land and remove all of their other abilities. And Aura of Silence is great for slowing down our opponents while doubling as removal. And all of these feed into our Enchantress synergies. Now I also really like Out of Time. This enchantment costs just 3 mana, and when it enters the battlefield you untap all creatures and phase them out until Out of Time leaves the battlefield. Then you put a vanishing counter on Out of Time for each creature phased out this way. And you remove a vanishing counter at the beginning of each of your upkeeps, and you sacrifice Out of Time when the last counter is removed. Now Out of Time can get a bunch of vanishing counters, again 1 per creature phased out, and especially when Phelddagrif can make creatures for just 1 green mana each, and yes, tokens do phase out. So do commanders, by the way. A phased out commander can't be put into the command zone, so it'll just cease to exist for the next 49 turns or whatever, or until someone destroys Out of Time. Of course, Phelddagrif, if it happens to be out on the battlefield when you want to deploy Out of Time, can just bounce itself back to your hand to avoid this effect. So at only 3 mana for a board wipe, Out of Time is a really great card in Commander, and I'm surprised it doesn't see more play. Now when it comes to mana ramp, we've got access to plenty of green auras like Fertile Ground and Weirding Wood. And of course, more potent enchantment-based ramp like Smothering Tithe and Mirari's Wake. Mirari's Wake makes each of your lands tap for an additional mana, which is great for powering up your endgame, letting you put that much more mana into Phelddagrif to give your opponents hippos or life, enabling your combos. And then finally we'll use Starfield of Nyx, which also helps recur your enchantments from your graveyard, while also animating your non-aura enchantments into creatures. And Hall of Heliod's Generosity, an enchantment deck staple, and this land helps provide some enchantment recursion as well. So that's most of the deck. Let's go over the deck stats and cost. This Phelddagrif Politics deck has an average mana value of 3.02. We are playing an enchantments deck in order to generate value, and so we've got 32 enchantments in this deck. We have 13 cards that can be used politically. This is kind of a vague category, but I've included cards here like Null Mage Advocate, which can recur specific cards in our opponent's graveyard to their hand, or Wedding Ring, which sort of shares card draw and life gain between you and target opponent. I've also included in this category all of our goad and forced combat effects like Psychic Impetus. This deck has 12 ramp cards and 13 pieces of card draw. Those card draw spells consist mostly of Enchantress effects, like Satyr Enchanter, but we also have a few other card draw pieces that aren't dependent on enchantments, like Ristic Study. And we're using 10 pieces of single target removal and 4 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $799.96 on TCGplayer.com. I built this deck without any real budget limitation, except that I chose not to include some of the really expensive reserve list cards, like Serra Sanctum, or some of the, like the old school duels like Tropical Island that are super expensive. Phelddagrif is also actually on the reserve list, but it's only about $20 right now. Now I often loosen the budget restrictions when I build a deck like this, because it's trying to accomplish a fairly narrow and difficult task. In this case, we want to be a political group hug-ish deck, but we also want to be able to win. We want to be non-threatening, but we also want to be able to protect ourselves. With such specific requirements, I wanted to be able to include high-impact cards like Ristic Study, Smothering Tithe, and Wedding Ring to give the deck the greatest possible chance of success. So that's Phelddagrif Political Enchantments. Phelddagrif is mostly used in this deck to facilitate our win conditions, but it is still a political commander, so if you enjoy politics and if you're skilled at negotiation, you can definitely use Phelddagrif's activated abilities to bargain for favors from other players. I found that the value generated by the enchantment theme and all the related payoffs really helped keep this deck in the game. Even so, outside of accruing value for ourselves, generally in the form of ramp and card draw, this deck is pretty careful not to generate a lot of threat. But there are a few considerations I want to point out. First, because we're focused so much on generating value, protecting ourselves, and playing politics, and with all the enchantments that we're trying to fit into the deck, we don't actually have room for instant speed interaction. This deck has no counterspells, for example. Actually, it doesn't even have any instants, and we only have 6 sorceries. So if you're playing against a heavy control deck that's dominating the board, you'll probably want to team up with the other players to help take down that control player before you go for the win, just to make sure that your win conditions don't get counterspelled. Fortunately, this deck does have the tools to work well with other players, when it wants to. Secondly, I was very selective about which political pieces I included in this deck, because again, in my opinion, most group hug cards don't actually help you win, and I wanted to avoid those types of cards. But as a result, the deck doesn't have as many political cards as you would typically see in a Phelddagrif deck. So I think if you want to play Phelddagrif and you want to win, and you're willing to sacrifice some of the politics to do it, it could be worthwhile to try this deck out. But that's all I've got for today. Let me know in the comments what you think about Phelddagrif. Is this a reasonable way to build a commander that's typically used purely for group hug? Or do you think that serious players just shouldn't be playing Phelddagrif at all? Also, let me know in the comments if there's any commanders or strategies you'd like to see made into future deck techs, especially unconventional ones. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.